letter.
Okay.
And then
I read the newsletter, and I really don't know how we could have gotten from that description.
No, neither do I.
This is like a cultural talk, like because the thing is too, and I actually because I was paranoid, I thought, oh God, have I like really offended him? I went back and listened to the end of my Woodland Networks audiobook, and I completely named him and thanked him in that recording. So like, I've been really careful that I make sure when I use someone's work, I name drop them, I talk about their newsletter, and I really don't know how we could have gotten from that description.
No, neither do I.
This is like a cultural talk, like.
Wait one sec. I'm just getting some intense delay.
Yeah, anyway, so it's, I just, yeah, I mean, I would really hate to feel that way, and I would have to talk directly to say, like, it's not my intention to ever, you know, take his work, and he's done great work, I love this book, it should be celebrated, you know, I have no problem, like, helping him sell it, if he wants.
No, exactly. I think he was, it seemed a bit like he was just a bit like, he had a bit of a funny day, and decided...
Oh, poor Russell. Because this is a good book, I like it, you know. And if he wants me to give him a signal boost, I'm happy to tweet about it if he wants. I mean, you know, not a problem for me.
Right. Yep, so we are now officially live.
Okay.
Just waiting, I had to send, because I created a new link. So I know now not to play on any old links, so I don't record myself. There is about, I've worked out today, there's about a 30-second delay on what we do versus what, but that just means that, you know, questions will, we also probably won't answer questions, you know, that quick in reality.
Yeah.
And I'll try and work on that delay, but I don't really know how to go about that.
By the way, what are our numbers looking like? Because I can't access the
Oh yeah, so I can tell you now, I'll type it out now so you have that, but our numbers looking really good. So we have about 120 people with tickets.
Cool. Is there a cap on that?
There's a cap of 200, but I figured we could make it higher if we wanted.
Because I posted about it on Friday, and I know I had a lot of people come back going, oh yeah, cool. And so what I'll do is I'll put another tweet out. Like I scheduled it to be like 10 a.m. London time, so I figured that's about the time people would want. So I've been using TweetDeck to like make sure it's not like in the middle of the night. So I'll probably send another one out. What is that?
So that's just like that's like the info at for our info at email. And then
it's because it did like this overlay.
Oh yeah.
And I had it's like a sidebar. That's so funny. See, that's the one I have. You know what? I wonder if I just mistyped or something.
Okay.
Okay, I thought you guys had changed the password, and I was like, fuck.
No.
Okay, cool. All right, excellent.
All right, so we now have 4 people watching.
Ooh.
So in theory, they can start telling us how is the audio. And hopefully we get a comment back at some point.
Oh, cool. So exciting. Future.
Yeah, it's quite weird. So I have to mute that. Technically, what's weird for me is I can't listen to the live stream, but I can listen to you, because otherwise my laptop would pick up. So I could wear headphones on the day.
Double. Well, the thing is, okay, so when I do, here's what I think will, like, because I know at least when I've been doing Zoom talks and stuff. When I launch into my presentation, just push mute on yourself.
Yeah.
So that no external crap will get picked up, and then I can just do my shebang. And then when I say thank you for coming, yada yada. Here's all my little. I do a little spiel at the end, like. Once again, yes, included. I go, stop it, visitors are open, pick up this, pick up that, get more information, go here, blah, blah, blah. When I do all that crap, then I'll be like, yay, and questions, and then, you know, then you can come back in. Because the thing is, too, since I'm going to be screen sharing my screen, I won't be seeing you.
Yeah, okay, excellent.
Feel like alone in a bathroom, like talking to myself.
That's right, well, I'm sort of alone in a bedroom with like a million different apps open, feeling like I have control over them, but... who knows?
Also, I don't know how to do is that like I think when you go into a PowerPoint slideshow, that is the main thing and nothing can override it. But I do have Telegram, like if there's a Telegram message, it overrides, for example, Chrome. But I don't think it'll override what's it called? PowerPoint.
Okay.
But so hopefully there will be like random messages.
Well, it's not. I mean, hopefully it won't. If it does happen, it's not entirely the end of the world. I mean. But you know, hopefully it won't. But don't worry about it if it does.
As long as it's not anything like utterly salacious.
Okay.
Like,
Eva is hearing everything 3 times.
Okay. Oh no! Oh no! Like a triple echo.
Yeah. That could have been while I had my microphone on. Maybe I still do. Oh. I don't want to quit. No. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, no.
If I just now need to mute my... Yeah. So I'm going to mute my audio for a bit so you won't hear me.
Right.
But maybe just feel free to start whenever you want, whenever's comfortable.
Okay, so basically, yeah, what I'm going to do is just give a short introduction about myself before I do this screen sharing. So my name is Romney Reagan. I wrote my PhD on the layered heritage of Abney Park Cemetery. So if you guys have gone on the website and you've seen, so they're on the link on the Abney Park website. I also have audio apps linked to my SoundCloud page. And I come from more of an artistic background, so what I was doing was creating artistic interventions with the heritage of Abney that then could be stripped out into 4 different layers that I studied to then have the audio experience. So what I'm going to say is somewhat of history of Abney Park, which is what I've studied for my thesis. The bulk of what I talk about as well is more of a public engagement perspective. So I'll also be sharing views about what Abney Park today in the community. So there are a couple layers to what I'm talking about, just as there were layers within my thesis. And so that's a little bit about me, why I'm here to share my research with you. And I'm going to try to now screen share. So first I'm going to pull up this. Sorry, PowerPoint. Then I'm going to, hang on. Sorry. First I'm going to screen share, then I'm going to pull up PowerPoint. That makes more sense. What am I? Sorry, let's see. Where is screen sharing? I'm just going to go to help. I thought this was like a really obvious like button somewhere where it was done. I feel like I've done this before. Maybe, you know what, I might have been in Zoom when this happened and it seemed more obvious. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I was thinking of Zoom actually. So let me just quickly. Yeah, sorry, Zach, can you jump in and like tell me where I can screen share? Because it's not obvious to me for some reason. Sure. It's like, it's not like, because on Zoom, it's just like on the bottom was like one of the options. And I thought it was going to be like that again. Oh, hang on. Found it. Oh, there we go. Okay, so there. Are you seeing me or seeing yourself, you should say? How are we doing? Did that work? Oh yeah, cool, awesome. Okay, so PowerPoint, slideshow, play from start. Okay, you can still see yourself in the corner, can't you? Or can you not? Because I can see you in the corner of the PowerPoint. I don't know if that's like only something for me or something you can see. Okay, cool. So you don't see yourself. That's perfect. Oh shoot, now okay, anyway, I'm so sorry. This is so funny. I'm so glad we're doing a tech run. This would be really embarrassing in like the real world. So anyway, yes, anyway, and myself, I've already introduced myself. So basically, right, so just to dive right in, Magnificent Seven. I think most of us are probably familiar with these, but some people might not be. This is a ring of Victorian garden cemeteries that's in what used to be around Outer London. And Victorian cemeteries were actually across the entirety of the UK. But the 7 that we know and love in London are Kensal Green, which was founded in 1833, West Norwood, which was in 1837, Highgate, 1839, Abney, 1840, Brompton, also in 1840, Nunhead, also in 1840, and Tower Hamlets in 1841. So the yeah. Oh, right. Okay. Is it working? Is it working? So are you now? Can you see the whole slide, or is there like me in the corner obscuring part of the slide? Oh, that's really. That's just not. Yeah. Not great. So hopefully, like the full, your full view should be a full just a slide presentation, right? Like, do you have other like? I just don't want people like looking at random stuff. I really like them to focus on the slides, ideally. Like I would, I mean, I shouldn't even be on video, hopefully, unless that's necessary for some reason. Yeah, because I just think I'd rather have them focus on the slides than me like just reading notes. That's not interesting. Like the slides are what the point is, really. Okay, cool. Awesome. So, right. So these garden cemeteries that I've just shared with you guys, these were created as artistic creations. So architects worked with both landscape and stonework to create these beautiful havens of remembrance, and they used mourning trees, shrubs, flowers, and masonry to get their message across. So Victorian era is perceived with, and this is an example, by the way, I was one slide behind. This is a painting of an Arcadian cemetery. This is the beautiful ideal, and this is also a link between the Arcadian idea of cemeteries and romantic painting, which I'll explain in a bit. But so the Victorian era is famous for the most thing it's probably most famous for is its perceived obsession with death and mourning. And I think we have this idea just a bit backwards. It's not so much that the Victorians were obsessed with death. It's actually we who are the folk dead. The Victorian aesthetic created a beauty within loss, and this drive to beautify objects surrounding a lost loved one was to make mourning a bit more bearable. And during this era, mourning was a very frequent part of everyone's daily life. The development of this idea of beauty within death has its root in a few factors. But the romantic period of painting and literature in the 18th century was the most impressionable upon this genre. This also grew into Gothic literature and the sublime painting of the 19th century. And this aesthetic in art progressed into the real world in the form of landscape and garden planting and the theme of an Arcadia. So an Arcadian theme basically just means something that is ideally pastoral. It's a created sense of the ideal within nature. And 18th century landscape gardens brought these ideas of these created Arcadias. They brought this feeling of a nostalgic romance, and they built mock ruins and classical feeling temples within the gardens. So these created set pieces were known as follies, and they evoked the idea of something that was beautiful that's now been abandoned. One of the most prominent examples of this Arcadian landscape idea was the 18th century grounds of STOURHEAD in Wiltshire, and I've been, and it's absolutely stunning. This is frequently used for movie shoots, and the most memorable recently being the passionate proposal scene between Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet. They stood in the mock temple in the rain for the Pride and Prejudice film with Keira Knightley. And STOURHEAD was the iconic ideal of this Arcadian landscape, and it's inspired countless others. It was this bittersweet sense of loss that these romantic landscapes evoked, which was the inspiration to bring these garden ideas into burial practices. But this process took a while, and I'll get to that in a bit. To bring some context into why changing burial practices was necessary, it's important to understand what burial was like in the beginning of the 19th century. So the Industrial Revolution brought about many changes to the way people lived. And one of the most impactful changes was this surge of people living in urban areas. By 1850, the population of London doubled from what it was at the beginning of the century, and sanitation and burial quickly became a problem. Small city churchyards were quickly filled to overflowing. Overcrowded churchyards led up to doubling up of grave use. This resulted in shallow graves. Corpses could be pushed to the surface by the shifting earth. This then invited animal interference, and it contributed to abhorrent smells and the contamination of local water. This engraving is from the famous scene in Charles Dickens' Bleak House,
when Lady Dedlock searches for the grave of her dead fiancé. She's horrified to discover that his body lies in such an overflowing, putrid churchyard. Between the visible body parts and the horrible stenches, these graveyards were awful to even walk past, let alone envision burying your loved one there or to spend any time by their graveside. So the idea to fix this situation was to create more burial space and to do so outside of London. So in 1832, Parliament passed a bill encouraging the establishment of private cemeteries outside of urban areas. The London Cemetery Company was born, and over the subsequent decade, they founded the Magnificent Seven. The garden cemetery movement wasn't begun with this 1832 bill, however. As I mentioned earlier, these ideas have been developing since the previous century, and this burial revolution didn't happen overnight. It actually took about 50 years to become a reality. The garden cemetery movement began in France, and it was actually way back in 1784 with a man very ahead of his time, Mr. Bernardin de Saint-Pierre. However, pinpointing the originator of this aesthetic is a bit problematic. A very protracted process of idea sharing and mutual inspiration took place between Britain and France during this time. Going back to our Romantic era landscape gardens and their mock ruins and Greco-Roman Arcadian nostalgia, European visitors fell in love with this aesthetic. And you can see in this garden here, the inspiration came for some cemetery chapels. These continental visitors to British gardens brought these designs back home to their own manor homes. It's a bit funny when you think that the British mock ruins were aimed to add their own bit of history to their lands, and they were alluding to the ruined abbeys and cathedrals that dot the landscape after Henry VIII's path of destruction known as the Reformation. The European landscape didn't bear the scars of Reformation, but now there's a nod to it in all the mock ruins that popped up as garden follies. But back to the main point. It was back in France that these British Arcadian garden ideas became the inspiration to bring these ideas into a mourning memorial. And for cemetery fans out there, you know where I'm going with this, Père Lachaise. This led to the founding of the iconic Père Lachaise Cemetery, which, just like London's eventual garden cemeteries, was founded outside what was then Outer Paris. And of course, now we regard Père Lachaise as an international treasure and landmark, but at the time, it wasn't such the easy sell that you might imagine. So, this really dense and unhelpful slide, but so the government wasn't convinced. St. Pierre submitted his proposals to Père Lachaise in 1784, but it took them 20 years to actually create Père Lachaise, which wasn't founded until 1804. And it wasn't until another 30 years after that that the great garden cemeteries were founded in Britain, which was in 1833. All of this was 50 years after European visitors first marveled at the Arcadian gardens that inspired the whole thing to begin with. This was most likely an issue of proof of concept, and Père Lachaise was certainly that. It quickly became world famous, inspiring a wave of completely new ideas of burial across Europe and also the United States. Nothing short of a revolution occurred. So, what garden cemeteries offered that local parish churchyards did not was a park-like atmosphere that could be a destination spot in its own right. A memorial in a garden would evoke not only memories of the departed within a comfortable and pleasing setting, but also ideas of Arcadia as well. The most important aspect was that all references to the horrors of decay, bones, decomposition, and the dank, unwholesome graveyard were swept away. Graves in beautiful landscapes, surrounded by honeysuckle, willows, and creeping ivies, were places where the living could linger over picnics and remember their dead in a way that almost seemed to suggest their continuing presence. But even before overcrowding turned the local church graveyards into putrid places, there were other big ideological differences between these two spaces. One thing that many people don't know is that graveyards and cemeteries are not the same thing. A graveyard, or a parish churchyard, as the name suggests, is attached to a church. Cemeteries, on the other hand, are separate places of burial, and they're not connected to a church. And this is a huge difference when it comes to what these spaces mean for communities. The cemetery company that founded Magnificent Seven was just that, a company. It was a secular entity. Some of the hints of the cemetery company's more fanciful secular designs can be seen in Abney Park's Egyptian Gates and in Highgate Cemetery's Egyptian Avenue. These garden cemeteries were designed to include funerary chapels. Some had separate chapels for Anglican and Dissenter. Some only had one chapel for everyone. Some of these chapels survive today, and some do not. However, none of these chapels was ever used for worship. There were no church services held here. They were used as memorial chapels to receive a coffin and sometimes holding a funeral. Neither the grounds of Abney Park nor the chapel are consecrated, and the chapel itself was created to be non-denominational. This was to invite people of a variety of different faiths. Abney Park Cemetery is fortunate that our chapel still stands today. It was burned to a ruin in 1970s, but with generous Heritage Lottery funding, the chapel is now stabilized to welcome visitors yet again for select events. Here's me leading a tour through the chapel, and as you can see, people are allowed to go inside the chapel as long as there's an event going on and a key holder present. The trust has received a second round of HLF funding to bring the chapel to the next stage from stabilization to renovation. There will even be public toilets, and I think that's the most exciting development of all. But back to the Victorians. When Victorian visitors visited garden cemeteries, this was a welcome refuge from the city center, and they used them as a day out to walk amongst gardens. Garden cemeteries were designed with paths for walking, gardens for pretty views, benches for visitors to stay for a time. And they weren't created merely to be looked at, but to be enjoyed as a place to spend the day. A family day out to have a stroll through the graves was not considered morbid, but merely a way to either show love for lost loved ones or just enjoy the garden. One interesting side note is that visiting a cemetery was only one of the few acceptable places that single ladies could go unchaperoned. So a walk through the gardens would be a perfect place for furtive courting, offering possibilities for marriage. These parks were indeed places of life continuing amongst death. So the unique design for Abney Park Cemetery was created by the combined efforts of the architect John Hoskins with famous horticulturist George LODDIGES. Their goal was to create a space that combined graves and mourning with public open space. This included an exotic arboretum of trees and flowers with non-native species from around the world. One more thing to remember is that our beloved community park, CLISSOLD Park, wasn't around at the time. CLISSOLD wasn't founded until 50 years after Abney Park opened, not until 1889. So for the second half of the 19th century, Abney Park's 32 acres were the main public space for the community. Abney Park was opened to the public in 1840. However, its long history as a wooded park predates its service as a cemetery by about 150 years, or possibly even more. So the site chosen for the cemetery was previously the grounds of Fleetwood House and Abney House. These properties were built in the late 17th century. And here is a wonderful glimpse of what the house would have looked like behind the wrought iron gates off Stoke Newington Church Street today. This image was made by Amir Doughton. He's the founder of History of Stoke. He has an amazing blog and Twitter account. If you're interested in Stoke Newington history, his Twitter handle is @HistoryOfStoke. So previous to being a cemetery, the land was the grounds of Abney House, and previous to that, the land was uncultivated woods and scrubland. As far back as documentation goes, the land of Abney Park has been a wooded park. And for the first 20 years of Abney Park's opening, there was actually a river flowing through it. So this slide is a page from my documentation of practice book that accompanied my thesis. And it shows, you can see here, there's the map of where the Hackney Brook used to flow. And there's also photos I took of the northern boundary of the cemetery today. It's hard to envision with how built up Stoke Newington is today, but the Hackney Brook River used to flow above ground, and it made up the northern boundary of the cemetery, which also, if you look on the map, you can see how it's a bit squiggly, and that's why. It's because it used to be a river. So this was, of course, went the way of many of London's old rivers and was covered over and turned into a sewer in 1860. Back when the land was the grounds of Abney House, however, the famous hymn writer Isaac Watts lived there, and Lady Abney was his patron. Excuse me. According to notes and records, he was inspired by the beautiful landscape of this residence to write his hymns. He would sit on the bank of the Hackney Brook to compose his hymns and watch the herons that nested on a little island in the river. If you walk to the northern boundary of the cemetery today, you can find a mound to the plaque dedicating the place to Isaac Watts. He might well have sat on this exact spot to write. Visiting today, if you close your eyes to the brick wall that's just ahead of you, you can almost envision the Hackney Brook flowing there right beneath your feet. And when you walk through CLISSOLD Park, you of course no doubt notice the duck ponds. And this is actually all that's left of the above ground Hackney Brook. They used to form part of its river course. So the Hackney Brook is still there today. It's just flowing underneath our feet through the earth. So why was Stoke Newington chosen as the site for the 4th cemetery and the cemetery company's Magnificent Seven? As the population boom accelerated, Stoke Newington became a popular suburban neighborhood for wealthy city workers looking for a picturesque retreat for their families. The area was lush and it was known for its rich soil. The design for the layout of the cemetery was worked on for over a year before Abney Park's official opening in 1840. LODDIGES planned an arboretum to conserve the existing woodland on site and also to work in his introduction of new imported species. LODDIGES planted about 2,500 varieties of trees and shrubs, including pines, firs, flowering fruit trees, magnolias, and rhododendrons. He included both hardy trees and more exotic specimens, including acacia, box, dogwood, maple, wild olive, and quince. LODDIGES also created a rosarium with 1,029 varieties of rose. I don't know about you, but I didn't even know there were over 1,000 varieties of rose. So learning that Abney Park had so many of these lovely flowers in one place was quite a surprise. And also another thing you might not guess from Abney's aspect today is that this collection was a nationally important treasure. It rivaled even the gardens at Kew. And in honor of this rosarium, the architect John Hoskins designed the 10-point rose window in the chapel. Abney Park was originally laid out with clearly defined areas for walking and burial, but as the cemetery business began to decline in the 20th century, the woodland ceded itself, and now Abney Park is a nature reserve and one of London's most important sites for wildlife. All the lost aspects of the previous plan I wish I could have seen, one of my favorites has to be the ancient cedar of Lebanon that used to be on the site. On the Stoke Newington Church Street entrance, the wrought iron gates I showed you earlier, they used to mark the entrance to Abney House. And just a short walk from these gates used to be that cedar of Lebanon. And for those of you who are familiar with Highgate Cemetery, you'll remember that up until last year, their Circle of Lebanon featured a mighty specimen of cedar of Lebanon. And this 100-year-old tree met its fate in August of 2019. And there we are. It's a sad, sad day. It finally went the way of its neighbors and died. It had to be removed. Abney Park cedar of Lebanon was the same species as Highgate's tree, and it was also the growth of many centuries. One remarkable feature of Abney's cedar, however, was it had a mower's scythe embedded in its trunk, and it was sticking out the side of the tree for reasons unknown. If the tree had survived today, this feature would have been a great addition to the cemetery landscape. The image this conjures of an ancient tree with a scythe embedded in it presents an allegory for the relationship between life and death, the grim reaper versus the tree of life. The cedar was not only visually unique, but it also would have been an interesting historical addition to the nature preserve, for Abney Park to be home to a tree that's twice as old as the cemetery itself. It would have been a reminder of the life that the land had before it became a cemetery, the aspects of the land that were shared with Abney House, the flowing Hackney Brook River, and the pensive rambles of Isaac Watts. Through my research, I couldn't discover what happened to this tree, and since there's no specific record I found of its removal, I must assume that the grand cedar died naturally in the course of time. There are amazing veteran specimens at Abney Park, but I truly wish I could have seen this tree. In 1890, many of the original trees were sacrificed to make room for the increased needed space for burial. This might have been what happened to the cedar of Lebanon, although removal of such an ancient tree for this purpose seems quite unlikely. So, as Abney entered the 20th century, space decreased and new burials dwindled. The cemetery then entered a time of sharp decline in revenue. This decreased revenue led to cutbacks in care, such as mowing and clipping, and the manicured garden aspect of the original planning began to give way to a rewilded aspect that we know and love today. The changes that Abney Park went through created what is called a secondary woodland, which is a forest or wooded area that's regrown after a major disturbance, in this case, pruning and gardening, until a long enough period of time has passed so that the effects of the disturbance are no longer evident. Abney Park self-seeded during World War II and has continued to do so ever since. Tucked throughout this woodland landscape today, you can still find some of the veteran trees that LODDIGES planted 180 years ago. They're still there for us to discover. Next time you visit the park, why not pick up a veteran tree map with you and go on a hunt to find them? I believe the Trust has a PDF version that we can share with you guys to make this available so you can print one out. Or when the park reopens after lockdown, you can just pick one up at the visitor center and say hi. Or you can even screenshot this if you want. It's low resolution, but there we go. There are about 24 of these historic trees left, but my favorite of these original specimens that survives is actually a bush. It's this holly bush. So this holly bush is 180 years old, and you would probably walk past it and maybe even have on some occasions and not even guess. Looking at the holly bush now, and actually, honestly, it's more of a tree these days, the time-worn graves that surround the holly look far older than the holly, but actually they're far younger than the holly is itself. And it's hard to recognize its impressive age with its bright green leaves. It's like the teenage vampire of Abney Park. Today in the park, the woodland is very overgrown, and 95% of the trees were not planted by human hand. But the timeline of how old the woodland is today isn't so simple to untangle. There are still shoots sprouting from the root systems that date to the 18th century trees planted during the era of Abney House and Fleetwood House. This creates a blurred concept of what is original growth. Even if the shoots themselves would be considered new growth, they're growing from an older original root system. This makes the ecosystem of Abney more complex to date than counting the rings on any one given tree. It truly is an interwoven world. The biodiversity and interdependence of Abney Park's various plant life and animal habitats ignites the imagination. I enjoy the imagery of dead bodies, buried trees that become deadwood, then become a rich habitat for everything from rare fungi to tawny owls, all of this in this grand cycle. However, this romantic utopian image I had of the full circle of life being present in the ecosystem of Abney Park, this image of a symbiotic relationship between human decomposition and the woodland canopy that surrounds visitors, this could not be further from reality. Only natural burial can benefit ecosystems in this way, and the Victorians were not eco. Victorians used embalming methods to process the corpse, which they then put into lead coffins, which were then housed in cement-walled tombs. All of this was done to stave off the appearance of death and the intrusion of nature. It's kind of ironic that all these efforts to appear lifelike are exactly what prevent the processes of life. And it's because of all this, it's not advisable to go mushrooming or indeed any foraging in Abney Park. Due to embalming fluid and lead leaching into the soil for 180 years, many species can contain arsenic. So to feast on Abney is to join the dead of Abney. Control yourselves. The first burial in Abney Park took place on the 3rd of June in 1840, and it was of the Reverend James Mather from Upper Clapton. He lies in a chest tomb just north of the chapel. There are approximately 60,000 grave plots in Abney Park, with approximately 30,000 headstones that have survived through time. There are just over 200,000 people buried in Abney. Abney Park entered a period of increased decline as it progressed through the 20th century. Revenue for upkeep from burials, as the cemetery became full, this much-needed revenue began to dwindle. The wide avenues of the original cemetery design were reduced to winding paths as more being this much-needed revenue. The problem with the Victorian ideal of in perpetuity is who is there to take care of the grave when all of your loved ones die themselves? The purchase of a plot was a flat fee. The upkeep for these graves stretches into the centuries, which means these graves are left to a generation of people to whom you are no longer in living memory. Previous to the Victorian ideal of in perpetuity, the local parish church would house your bones in the graveyard until it was time to move them to the charnel house. This would free up your grave space for a new body that was within living memory. This system worked well when populations were small, and much like the perennial cleaning of the Louvre, by the time you reached the end of the graveyard, you could start right back at the beginning again and use that same grave space. The idea of having a marker for you and only you forevermore was the purview of the wealthy who could afford to be buried inside the church under the crypt. In the crypt, you know what I mean. The rest of the population had to go by the living memory rule, and they had an eventual end in the charnel house. The aspirational Victorian era offered the idea of a permanent memory in stone for the middle classes. It wasn't just the elite of the church crypt. Now almost anyone who could afford it could be remembered forever in stone. The stone might be permanent, but the initial funds paid for its upkeep were not. This idea of a, in quotes, permanent burial, you have dwindling inventory with no more being created, and with no more revenue coming in, the living relatives then dying off, you have this expensive upkeep with no assistance. It's a business model doomed to failure. And this was the common fate for all Victorian garden cemeteries as they progressed through the 20th century. Over time, Abney Park's highly organized grandeur was transformed into a more wild, unkept, and disorganized space. As a result of the decrease in burial and the increase in wildness, the use of the cemetery became more mixed. The primacy of its memorial function began to be overtaken by its use for secular recreation and hopes for conservation. So why do people visit cemeteries today? The motivations for visiting a cemetery are varied, and there are many reasons to visit a cemetery other than to pay respect to a dead loved one. And these garden cemeteries were designed with these uses in mind from the very beginning. In Victorian times, these cemeteries were created as leisure space, a location for strolling along shaded paths, picnicking before the development of city parks, allowed citizens to escape the noise and chaos of urban life. I mean, look at these guys, they have sausages. Cemeteries provided a primary space for enjoying the outdoors in an urban context. And that tradition continues today. Our cemeteries have not just recently evolved to become our community parks. They were always meant to be so. However, this is not to say that cemeteries are exactly the same as a local park. Even if visitors have come just to walk their dog, there's a reason why they came to the cemetery to walk their dog. These spaces are special, they're different, and that these burial sites not only offer contact with nature, but they also provide places to contemplate our mortality and confront symbols of death in a pleasing and peaceful way. So the question comes to this: can we create cemetery space that welcomes the community while also respecting a heritage of mourning? I believe the conversation can move forward in a constructive way when we realize the motivations for community use and memorial use are not mutually exclusive. It would be inappropriate to treat any cemetery as exclusively a community park and exclude entirely its status as a cemetery space of mourning and memorial. I think it's important for events teams to communicate effectively with the community that their cemetery events calendars are not a negation of memorial. That's not the goal. It's rather that mixed use works alongside the memorial aspect of the cemetery. The debate is not between for memorial and against memorial. Event space and memorial space can and should coexist peacefully. Using cemeteries as this kind of a social space does, however, raise a few questions. What are the guidelines for appropriate behavior? How should tourists and visitors behave in the company of mourners? And who decides what constitutes respect for the living and for the dead? It can become quite a heated discussion within any space that deals with death, as there's a fine line between celebration and joy and then flat-out irreverence. These issues of who creates the guidelines of appropriate behavior is a debate that many people working with any kind of a community space will be familiar with. While a cemetery can be seen as a community space by most visitors and even by some mourners, the lines of appropriate use are divided by some really subjective concepts of what is considered respectful, creating an atmosphere of solemnity or an atmosphere of a celebration of life. Over time, shifting cultural attitudes have formed what are considered the acceptable and unacceptable activities within a cemetery space. Community use of cemeteries has evolved over community use of cemeteries has evolved over many centuries, and it's not remained a static relationship. There's no such thing as, quotes, the way things always have been done, because it is constantly changing. Some members of the community will feel that celebrating life amongst death is how they want to honor their loved ones. Some other members will feel a solemn memorial is best. It is this tension between celebration and solemnity that within the cemetery space, and neither perspective is wrong. One thing that's unavoidable is that our contemporary attitudes toward death and dying are changing. Our current cultural desire for a secular mortality mediation space means that mixed use of cemeteries as community space are likely to become more commonplace, not less so. As cemeteries today embrace a variety of perspectives and voices within their walls, and mixed use brings a sense of community relevance to what is arguably a dying mode of body disposal and grief, the transformation of the perceptions of cemeteries from morbid and solemn to celebratory and inclusive will evolve as society's sensibilities towards death evolve, and cemeteries will undergo a cultural perception shift once again. And there's a very nuts and bolts reality to consider here too, the expensive upkeep of cemetery space. Most cemeteries receive no outside funding. They're largely run by volunteers who help the underpaid staff, and they need to raise money themselves. Even heritage lottery funding, as was given to Abney Park to stabilize the chapel, is strictly earmarked for renovation purposes. It's not a blank check. Events bring in much needed revenue to keep the cemetery gates open and free for everyone. Events also keep interest in cemetery heritage alive. If a heritage site doesn't invite engagement with younger generations or address the increasing diversity within our neighborhoods, then heritage cemeteries will cease to be relevant for their communities. But one very large issue facing many heritage sites today, not just cemeteries, is this idea of continuing community relevance. The audiences for our heritage sites are aging out. As frequent surveys reveal, the age brackets and racial demographics for heritage visits are largely illustrating an older white audience. So what does that mean for a heritage site wishing to be in a living community space for today and tomorrow? For our contemporary communities, which are a collection of diversity, people of color, LGBTQ, non-Western perspectives, and a younger globalized identity. I love history, and I don't want to overwrite it. I don't believe that including more heritage stories, we have to silence any existing perspectives. We should listen to each other and move forward with respect, but we must move forward. And it's by the action of all heritage sites, including cemeteries, opening their gates to events and celebrating continuing changing life that we're ensuring their community relevance for future generations. There isn't scope within this talk to delve into the seismic changing attitudes towards end-of-life care, evolving green burial initiatives, or the death positive movement. But these are also hugely transformative forces as well. It's just a matter of evolve or perish. Even cemeteries can die. So, yeah, with that super dramatic ending, I just want to thank you so much for joining me for this presentation today. Don't forget to come and say hi when the Visitor Center is open again. There's lots more information to share about the history of Abney Park and also Stoke Newington. You can pick up the veteran tree map I mentioned, Russell Miller's in-depth study on horticultural in Abney Park, the trees of Abney Park, and also there's work by local artists and information about our events. And if you can't wait until we reopen and you want to go, you can't wait to get into Abney content now, my audio walks are also available through the Abney Park website. Also, if you like, there's a SoundCloud app that has my audio walks. They're all free to stream, and you can walk through a cemetery on your own anytime. And also, if you're interested in wonderful and weird tales of folklore through the British Isles, my blog, Blackthorn and Stone, has new tales of folklore every week that I upload. Thank you. Yeah, so hang on.